Hey everyone, I'm Scott, and today I want to talk about your brain. But before we do that, we need to talk about the greatest commandment in the Bible. I know what you're thinking, you're like, no, I want to talk about my brain, that's way more interesting, but we'll get there. Before we do that though, the greatest command in the Bible, in Matthew 22, we read about the greatest commandment in the Bible, and we know it's the greatest because that's what Jesus said. And if Jesus tells us something is the most important, then we should listen to him. And so in Matthew 22, what happens is this group called the Pharisees, they were Jesus's enemies. They come and try and trick Jesus. And they try and trick Jesus by saying, Jesus, what's the most important law in the Old Testament? And they wanted to trick Jesus because there's like 613 laws, and how could you say that one law of God is more important than the others? And there's no definitive answer. So they thought that they kind of finally were able to trick Jesus. Well, Jesus is not one to be tricked, and so Jesus has this whole thing under control. And look at how he answers this question of what is the greatest commandment. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment." Jesus says this is the most important commandment in the Bible. Love God with everything you have. And so it's not really like a commandment, like some rule that we don't want to follow. This is actually a pretty fun command. It's a command to love. And in fact, Jesus says there's a second commandment, which is almost as important, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And so the whole Christian life can be boiled down to two truths: love God, love other people. But I want to dig deeper into that commandment to love the Lord your God. Let's look exactly at what Jesus said one more time. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. In this passage, Jesus says that there's three different ways to love God: with your heart, your soul, your mind. In another passage, he had strength, but I want to focus on that last one, your mind, because remember, we wanted to talk about your brain. And so what does it mean to love God with all of your mind? What does it mean to love God with all of your brain? Well, here's the first thing it means. It means thinking rightly about God. You see, I don't think many Christians are loving God with all of their minds because they don't think rightly about God. You see, we all have a different view of God. Every person, whether you're a Christian or not, you have a view of God in your head. Maybe you think that God is like a nice old grandpa who makes rules but doesn't really care if you break them. So you don't really pay attention to following what he says. Or maybe you think that God is a jerk. He's like a dictator and you don't like him. You don't like his rules, and so you rebel against him. Or maybe you just feel like God started the world and walked away and he doesn't care. He's like some absent father. You see, we all have an idea of God, and that's really important. In fact, look at what this Christian teacher, a famous Christian teacher named A.W. Tozer, said about our thoughts about God. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Think about that statement. What you think about God is the most important thing about you because it's going to affect your choices in life, your lifestyle, your view of right and wrong. If you think God doesn't care about what you do, then you're going to do whatever you want. Or if you think that God doesn't love you, then that's going to affect the way that you live your life and you treat other people. And so your view of God is the most important thing about you. And here's the thing. I think a lot of Christians don't think rightly about God. See, a lot of Christians, I think that our view of God doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from pop culture or from friends or some church that we went to when we were kids that has nothing to do with the Bible and nothing to do with the God of the Bible. And so how do you think rightly about God? You start by going to the Bible because it's in the Bible that God has revealed himself. And so to love God with all of your mind means that you begin to understand who God really is, and you accept that and you submit to that. But there's a second way that we can love God with all of our minds. When we use our brains to honor God, then we're also fulfilling this command by Jesus. So how do you use your brain to honor God? You see, it happens when you use your brain to the fullest to the glory of God. Now, when I say use your brain to the fullest, I don't mean like a sci-fi movie where someone uses 100% of their brain and they begin to telepathically throw objects across the room. That would be really cool, but that's not what Jesus is getting at. What Jesus is saying is, look, whatever you do with your life, whether you are a doctor or an engineer or an artist or a teacher or a scientist, whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. Use your mind in your field of study, in your work, to the best of your ability, to the glory of God. If you're a scientist, be the greatest scientist you can to bring God glory. If you are a student, be the greatest student you can be. Study as hard as you can to bring glory to God. You see, to love God with all of your minds means that when you go to school, when you go to work, you go there and you say, how can I do my job? How can I study this thing? How can I think about this in a way that will bring God glory? And it also means that you ask yourself, how can I look at my field? How can I look at my occupation? How can I look at my job? How can I look at my studies differently because I have a relationship with God? How can I approach the medical field differently because I'm a Christian doctor, as opposed to maybe a lot of the other doctors around me? How can I approach my job as an engineer, being a Christian engineer? How can I be an engineer for the glory of God? And so when we start connecting our jobs and our schoolwork to our faith with Jesus, we are using our minds to their fullest to bring God glory. And I think that's just some of what Jesus meant when he said to love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. It's a challenge to think rightly about God, but also to think rightly about thinking, to understand and ask the question, with whatever I do in my life, how can I do it to the glory of God? So I want to challenge you and I want to ask, do you love God with all of your mind? Do you think rightly about God? And then do you go to your job or your school saying, how can I use my mind to its fullest to honor God, to bring him glory, and to share his love with other people? Thanks so much for checking out this video. If you like this one, you might want to check out another video we have called Can Intelligent People Believe in God? But if you have any questions or comments, please put those in the comments below, and please subscribe to my channel. Thanks.